Fucking Hippies by Samuel Wright. Terry had walked down a mountain for 3 hours, crossed a raging river in a boat with a cow, and hitched a ride to Rishikesh in a lorry driven by a very chatty man who believed in reincarnation and eye contact, neither of which made for very good road sense. Now, Terry wanted cake. As far as Terry was concerned, the cake shop in Rishikesh was second only to the bookshop in Rishikesh in heading up his very short list of things in Rishikesh that didn't make him want to punch himself. The fact that he came to Rishikesh once a week on his days off was a tribute solely to the high quality of the cake and the books available at those two establishments, and was in no way a reflection on the rest of Rishikesh. As far as he was concerned, the rest of Rishikesh could go fuck itself. Today was a day for plum cake, he decided. He had a particular seat in the cake shop where he could sit with a new book and look out over the Ganges and see almost no people, unless they actively threw themselves in the water, which they only did occasionally. Of course, he did see Indians, that went without saying, but Indians were okay. He was in India. You signed up for that. He went to a strip bar for strippers, you went to India for Indians. Preferably in saris with coloured bits on their faces, or children, laughing, happy children, with stick-thin legs holding out their hands, children like the ones back in the village, who wore sweetly mismatched clothes and giggled at everything you said. He loved that. It was impossible to teach them, or not with learning objectives and formative assessment and proper accountability like back home, but the classes were such fun. He'd start trying to do some kind of grammar, and by the end it would just be a free-for-all with a half-deflated football. Terry opened his new PG Wodehouse, readied a mouthful of plum cake, and sat back. "Oh my God," said a voice. Terry narrowed his eyes at the page. "It's the same." The cake was fast turning to ashes in his mouth. "It's like karma." His eyes closed all the way in pain. He was willing to bet it wasn't. "Don't you think? It is, isn't it? Exactly. He has exactly the same hair as Tim." His eyes snapped open. He looked up. They were looking at him. The first one, who was pointing excitedly, had a cloth patchwork bag over her shoulder. The second wore a gypsy shirt. The third, a man, had a thin braid of hair with beads on, snaking down the back of his head. Hippies. Terry shuddered. A chill settled around his heart. He stared resolutely at the page. Bertie Wooster was having a cocktail and worrying about something. A chair scraped. The words in front of his eyes blurred with panic as he felt the approach of footsteps. "Hi!" He looked up apprehensively. A beaming face smiled down at him. "Sorry to disturb you, but you've got the exact same hair as our friend Tim." Terry arched an eyebrow. He meant it to be dismissive, but it failed. She perched on a chair. "So, where you from?" "Kent," said Terry. "Where's that then?" He looked at her incredulously. "Kent?" "Yeah, where's Kent?" "Next to Surrey." "And?" He blew air out through his nose in a sort of quasi-laugh and looked back at his book. In the process, he couldn't help noticing her breasts. Not just the shape of them either. She was wearing some kind of garment made by children or lepers, with string holding it together instead of sensible buttons and zips. But in the process, between spangly material and a plunging neckline, he saw actual shadowy nipple. Something stirred deep within him. "Sorry, my friend, I'll leave you to your book." He looked up again and smiled and made an embarrassed face and tried to ignore the way she said "my friend" as if the whole of humanity was her friend, and concentrated instead on that glimpse of nipple. "No, I'm sorry," he said, closing the Wodehouse decisively. "I'm just a bit, you know," he paused and made a modest face. I've been up in the hills for a while." He met her eyes. She cocked her head. He looked soulful. They talked for a bit. He told her about teaching, the village, how he'd learned some Hindi. She seemed pretty impressed. She'd been travelling around, you know. She loved India. In her defence, not only was she nicely cynical and self-deprecating at times, she was also increasingly attractive. She had a squidgy face, but as you spoke it moved in nice ways, and her waist was narrow behind all that gypsy crap. After they'd chatted a bit, they joined the friends she'd been with at first. They all talked together about Tim and his similar hair. That lasted a little while. Then there was stuff about where you'd been, you know, your normal traveller top trumps. My tiger sanctuary beats your rat temple for danger. But the rat temple trumps most other things for being just plain nasty. This segued, of course, quickly into food and illnesses, the winner being the bead hair man for eating fermented yak cheese in a Buddhist temple that gave him the shits for 17 days. Liar, thought Terry. Anyway, he felt he had the moral victory. He was the only one who was doing something useful. He was pretty sure Angela, the girl, was aware of this. So when she suggested he join them at an open mic night later, he blundered right ahead. "Sure," he said, "I'd love to." She told him to just turn up, and she'd see him in there. It was in a hall belonging to some kind of foundation. He'd spent the day wandering round town, wondering if he should really go. He even stood looking vacantly into the window of the didgeridoo shop, hoping that his raging hatred of the man inside and his Thai fisherman's trousers would quench his raging horn. The horn won. He arrived at the hall just before 8. It had various hanging plants festooning the front and some tinkly bits of tat hung from them. There was a hand-drawn poster advertising the evening's jam session in curly letters sprinkled with OMS. He stood outside for a bit, watching people go in. Quite a varied audience, he supposed. Well, old hippies, young hippies, hippie spawn, all sorts. There are even some Indian hippies. Eventually, he screwed up his courage and went on. He sat down, scanning the assorted cross-legged folks scattered across the floor for his new friend and her nipple. Couldn't see her. Around him, people were gathered in loose groups, chatting away. He sat, trying to look serious, listening. He could hear some girls to his left talk excitedly about some songs they'd written and were going to perform. Peppered into the conversation all round was much mention of the following words: energy, enlightenment, chakra, yoga, guru, inja, amazing, and wow. He tried to think of Jeeves. Then the compere stepped out. He had dreadlocks, and his name was Paradox. He announced that they would begin by laughing for 10 minutes. Terry chuckled a bit. It always annoyed him when comedians were too cocky, but he felt he ought to get into the spirit of the thing. Beside him, the girls were reverently stony-faced. Paradox retreated, not having even attempted any jokes, and leaving behind on the stage a spindly woman with the smile of a psychopath. Terry began to worry. "Laughter is the best therapy," said the woman. "It frees the soul. It lets the spirit fly." Terry felt a plunging sensation in his gut that he had last experienced when falling out of a tree aged 8, shortly before breaking his arm. She didn't do anything funny. She just told them to place one hand on their belly and one on their heart, breathe from the diaphragm, and release the soul's music. Apparently a forced bark of laughter. The horrible thing was, everyone obeyed. It was like the Nazi party had all taken acid and dressed up as fuckwits. "Everyone in a circle," barked the commandant. Terry found himself moving into place. He didn't know how to stop it. He was just deciding that he'd have to make a run for it, elbowing past the laughing goons on his way out, when he saw Angela. She caught his eye, and a wide smile spread across her face, maybe even a blush. His heart started pounding. Then, as the circle wobbled into shape, she was making her way towards him, and by the time the commandant had taken her place in the middle, they were next to each other. She winked at him. That was the cruelest touch. That was what held him there. Nothing else could have during the horror that followed. "Okay, people," said the commandant. "I want you to open your hearts, release the child within, and hop round the room, giving me a great belly laugh of ha, 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 he, he. As you do so." And everyone did it, including, to his eternal shame, Terry. Admittedly, his heart was not really open as he did so. If anything, it was sobbing bitterly in rage and misery, and beating its tiny ventricles against the cage of his ribs in a desperate attempt to escape this cruel world. Terry imitated Jeeves, though, and kept the upper lip stiff. As far as Angela and everyone else was concerned, he was nourishing his soul with mirth. It went on from there. After the bit where they had to shake everyone else's hand and laugh while meeting their mad, mad eyes, he was broken. He sat without protest through several odes to Mother Ganges. He mumbled listlessly along to a chanted chorus of "Inja, oh Inja." He didn't even scream obscenities at the top of his voice when listening to someone's song about how they found the meaning of meaninglessness while on acid in Goa. Then, just as Damien was starting his movement in celebration of life, which at this stage involved standing on one leg with his eyes closed, Angela leant over to him and said, "Shall we leave?" Her eyes were bright and inviting. His heart soared suddenly into life. He shook his head, brushing off the detritus of desperation, and surfaced back into hope and the raging horn. She led him out by the hand. Outside, she giggled. They kissed without speaking. Her lips were cool and wet. "Wasn't that amazing?" she said. He wasn't going to disagree. "Come with me," she said. "I've been inspired." She took him down narrow streets to her hotel. They kissed in the lobby. His penis was hard. She pressed it against her. They went to her room. They kissed. She pulled her tasselled thing off. He unzipped his flies and stepped out of his trousers. She straddled him and put him inside her. Wow, he thought. Amazing. Hadn't felt like that in a while. He looked at her, sitting above him. She moved over him. A creeping unease stirred inside him. Her eyes were closed. She breathed in deeply. He could see her diaphragm move above him. With mounting horror, he saw one hand move to her heart and one to her belly. All the pent-up sexual desperation of the evening dissipated in an increasingly flaccid instant as she began to bark out heartily, "Ha! Ha! Ha! He! He! He!" The next time Terry was in Rishikesh for cake, he bought some pornography. It was just easier all round.